Well, I grew up on 96th Street, and to me this was Central Park, the north end of the park. And I'm sure that I thought of the southern part of the park as that really nice park outside of the plaza. But it wasn't the sort of great civic spaces of, the Great Hill, or this was actually what the Conservatory Garden looked like when I was a kid. It wasn't these spaces that really spoke to me. I spent almost all of my time of almost every school day afternoon on the edges of the North Meadow in these rocks and in the woodland edges. Then in 1983, I came back to work in Central Park on the horticulture crew. And again, I felt the same kind of pull to the woodlands in Central Park. Although it was amazing to work on Literary Walk, the places I think I learned the most and that I had the most fun, actually, were places like the Falconer, where I really understood what an art form pruning was. Working with Neil Calvanese and the tree crew to prune so that it would reveal the sculpture, but also it would shape the forest so that they would be seen with the same eye. And we also worked a lot in the Loch and the North Woods. And here, not only were we doing selective thinning, but we were also trying to encourage the places that people could walk and couldn't. I think this has been a theme throughout a lot of the day. How do you actually create these woodlands when creating them means that you have to have people kept out of certain parts of them? So I think we're all here because we realize that these woodlands are very precious in all of the projects that we've seen. But I sort of wanted to think about why they're precious. And we know that they're very valuable. So is it just the ecological value, linking to a larger ecosystem of the Hudson River bioregion, as Keith was talking about, and the Atlantic Flyway? Or is it the real environmental values of ecosystem services, dealing with issues of global warming, biodiversity? And those are two very distinct realms. But I think today we've heard so much also about just the qualities of the woodland, the words like emotion and feeling and experience. And for me, this is really where I kind of find my way into the idea of woodland regeneration. It's how do you actually position people within nature to feel very much part of it and not that they're just looking at it. I think this sort of intersects with a move or a general trend to really appreciate more the idea of wildness in the culture. This is actually, I think, around the world, where it was once sort of threatening. Now places like the Western Ghats of India, where I've been working since 1997, as well as in our own backyards, people really are hankering more for an experience of wildness. And this, in fact, is my own front yard, which was since 2005 I've been kind of managing as a woodland and also a garden, and which was written up in the New York Times because I got a summons for growing weeds in my front yard. But what I did, it was a big rectangle of lawn, 1/3 of an acre, and I also have been appreciating how many people have talked about lawn as not a 4-letter word, as something we actually need and we use. And so I mapped out the areas that we needed to keep as lawn just because we lived there. And then I let everything else go for a year or two, and then I realized that you can't let things go, that you have to manage very carefully. So with a landscape guy named Roddy von Seldenek, we've been doing this management over the last 5 or 6 years. And it's extended into the actual building site as well. So while we've had reforestation, we've had the first flush of cherries and other sort of pioneer species, and now we have about 8 red oaks, and a lot of sort of hardwoods are coming in. We also have this mulberry seeding into the concrete terrace that was there. And so it's starting actually to come into the building. And we're going to have to adapt to this as this grows, because we'll have to rethink what this terrace is as this becomes a real mature tree. So for the article that Ann Raver wrote, I wanted to get some of the metrics about what I actually was doing. And the Natural Resources Defense Council gave me a few calculations, and they said that in my property, just changing from lawn to forest was sequestering about 5 tons of carbon per year, which isn't a huge amount. If you consider how much I fly around, it's really negligible. But if you add up my whole neighborhood, it actually comes to quite large numbers. And then also the water retained and not sent out to the already very overtaxed sewer system in Philadelphia amounts to about what would fill up one swimming pool. That doesn't seem like a lot, but when you think of all of that multiplied by how many houses, it actually is quite significant. You'll see on the left here, this is what I call the ugly phase of regeneration, which is when it starts to grow and you start to have to kind of cut it back and hack it back. And in this case, I keep some of it cut back and coppiced sort of permanently. That area on the left is a huge thicket of black cherries that I keep cut to about 3 feet, and there are sort of a number of reasons I want to do that. One is because I don't want to have the kind of black cherry forest that's sort of sterile on the ground plane. Another is that I also don't want to be a really bad neighbor, so I cut it back before it blooms so that I don't become the sort of source of a massive bank of seeds for to go into other people's yards. And I have a tradition at my house of kind of getting the neighbors a little bit upset. But now that it's been in the New York Times and it was on the garden tour this year, they're much nicer. So talking a little bit about germination karma, which I think is why I don't let the black cherries go. There was one occurrence of it already, which was that all of these cherries were growing, and most of them were black cherries. And then there was one ornamental cherry that I can't identify that I let go. And this one in the foreground. And about 3 years ago, it started to look like it was leaning. And I looked at it, since I'm not great at leaf ID, and I realized that it was a weeping cherry. And it's just a little bit of karma, because for so many years on residential projects, when you've done this very sort of low-key plan and elegant, the client would say, oh great, that's fine, but where am I going to put the weeping cherry? So one seeded right into the most prominent spot in my yard. After that article, I got emails from people really around the world saying, one person in India wrote me saying, thank God somebody finally understands my theory of gardening. And what I really found out is that there's this, which some of you already knew and know, but there's this big wild gardening movement or resurgence right now. And I just sort of tapped into that unknowing. And you know, if you Google wild garden, you get almost 1 million results. I know. I was thinking you're 6 million this morning. How am I going to say 860,000? Sounds very little. However, it's probably a lot more than it was, 5 years ago or 10 years ago. So I wanted to sort of look at what it means to think about wild landscapes in practice, not just wild gardens, but our public projects and larger private projects as wild landscapes. And I did this for a study for Lake Ontario, just to look at what different kinds, similar topography would be like if it were treated in very different ways. And what's happened, I think, is that lower image, which is the sort of generic pastoral park, has just become really devalued. People think that it's just neutral, and that a lot of people said it's not designed. And the upper image that would have been very off-putting maybe 10 years ago for some people now has a lot of currency. People really are very much valuing the boardwalk through the woodland. And so I was looking at the different strategies, design strategies that are deployed, and that kind of strategy is the idea of the figure ground, where there's a conceit here. This is actually a project by Turnscape that won, I think, the lead award at the ASLA this year. But this is a very common conceit where you're actually creating this entire landscape, including the wetland. But the conceit is that the wetland is, quote, natural, and it's always been there, and you design it to look like it was always there. And then you have this very intensely designed, beautiful, man-made object, boardwalk, across it. And I think we're sort of in the age of the boardwalk. I think the most famous example, not being Coney Island right now, but the High Line. But then in projects that don't have boardwalks, there also is the sort of figure ground of the forest actually being the figure that lies on the ground of the meadow. And this is a project that I've done with Stephen Harris and Lucian Reese-Roberts. and the meadow being the ground that actually moves right through the building. And the woodlands pop up in these patches, and it's very intensely managed so that the woodland really seems to be floating above the meadow at the edges. Then another strategy that is deployed, over the ages is the sort of cellular structure, or the bubble diagram. This is Mount Vernon, George Washington's house on the Potomac. And what's incredible about it is that you arrive and it's very imposing, and this flat panel is really beautiful and looks very artificial. But then you'll see in this plan, is that the, yeah. This is that view that you just saw, but then to get to the house you actually go through this designed wilderness. Both sides. I don't know if it's supposed to be one way, but either one you pick, you go through this managed woodland that's very wild, and then get to the domestic world, and then move out into the agricultural world. So it's a little sort of microcosm of the American landscape as it was conceived at this time. And you can see here in this view how important those two wildernesses are to the whole structure of the place. Central Park, from some of the maps we've been seeing, can be thought of as a bubble diagram as well, but for anybody who has worked there or just explored, you really realize that it's a network. It's a network of roads and drives and paths and woodlands and axes and meadows and structures and recreation areas. And it's such an unbelievably, people have used the word complex, it's such an unbelievably complex design. But this kind of design also has become devalued. People think of it as sort of, old school pastoral design. And I think one of the places that I saw that most poignantly was at Duke Farms this summer when I went out to see. It was open to the public, 2,700 acres, 700 of which are the pleasure gardens that Buck Duke built for his family starting in 1912. And it really has many, many very formal structures, sort of balustrades and these walled gardens. But the master plan that was done by Andrew Pogan with Duke Farms really looked at rebranding the place as a wildlife restoration and habitat restoration. And these are all images from the website, and nothing of the previous kind of design is shown in the website. And so I think it's kind of incredible that the history of this as a built landscape is just nowhere privileged in this whole. But the good news is that it's still there. You're not going to need an archaeologist to retrieve it when 10 years from now somebody's going to say, yeah, but what about the historic structures of this? And all you're going to need is a lot of lawnmowers and some brush hogs and a number of chainsaws to kind of get back the historic landscape. Beth Meyer actually introduced me to this nature park, which has a very different approach, where the artifacts of human construction are very much integrated into the growth of this nature park, which was a degraded site that gradually became reforested on its own. And this nature park uses integrates paths with the existing forest. So it's integrating the culture and nature, but it also is very smart about how it's choosing plants. The plants are either birches, which are very much promote sort of successional patterns, or Robinia, which are going to have a huge impact in nitrogen fixing and increasing the fertility of the soil. So it's both on the science and the art fronts very, very progressive. A project that I started in 2003 with Marpilio Pollock Architects and a very big team was at Queens Plaza. This was the image that we actually put together for the proposal that won the job. And in it, we tried to integrate the idea of growth and plant growth and a sort of an idea of an urban woodland with the idea of infrastructure and acoustical issues and energy and connections. And the landscape has to do an awful lot of work to remediate some pretty major problems, like the noise from the roadbed and the noise from the screech of the elevated trains. And so the design went through a lot of iterations, but the major issue now, not major issue, but the major product of the work has been that it has a very modulated series of woodlands, not like woodlands like Central Park, but plantings that really are operating as a kind of an urban woodland and a kind of a complex system. So there's the subsurface wetland that's filtering all of the water from the park. And there's this planting of hornbeams that are canopy trees. So they'll grow up to be tall trees, and that's sort of relating to the scale. And I think we've heard about scale. Scale is such a huge issue. It's relating to the scale of the elevated. And then and that's also where the driveways for the roadbed run right through that forest. And then there's the Understory River, which is actually Amanda Burden called it a river, and it's kind of stuck. But that's where people really can use the park as a public park, and it's at the scale of the understory, really to make you feel as if you are in this refuge, to sort of ratchet down the scale to be a little more human scale. And so the work really does try to integrate ecology and the infrastructure and art. And we've heard from a lot of people about how important art is in this process. And I think that in terms of sustainability, it's often the forgotten circle in the Venn diagram, because it's really, art is something that also really helps people to connect with a place and take real proprietary interest in it, as well as the sort of other ineffable benefits that art brings to a project like this. So we worked with Michael Singer. Michael Singer also was a full partner with me on the project to design the pavers and those curbs where the water actually goes out into the wetland. You can see these little holes. Oh. You can see these little slots where the water actually goes out into that wetland. And so it really is the intersection of the sort of working wetland and these handmade artifacts with this large engineered infrastructure. And Michael Singer also worked with Marpilio Parlik on the design of the benches so that the ground plane really does come up to become the seating. It's being managed by the Parks Department, as I think in the sort of mode of urban garden, where it's really being managed like a garden, with a zone gardener in charge. And that's something that a lot of urban woodlands actually need, because they need to be really treated with that hand approach, so that you're moving things around, you're seeing how things actually are coming, and it's with like Bill Noble with perennial gardens, you're gonna constantly be moving things around. And it's also pulling apart the sort of wilder areas from these more sharp urban areas, so that you're not actually using the same brush to paint all of the site. And with any project like this, I feel like with sort of wild garden projects, you need a very strong structure, a strong formal organization, in order for the whole thing not to fall apart. I think that it's something that underlies the best of the sort of wild garden and wild landscapes. And here you can kind of see, as it's starting to grow in, what that structure is. A park that I worked on, the schematic design in 1996, the Living Water Park, is actually a demonstration of how water can be cleansed biologically. And I worked there with the artist Betsy Damon. It also was the first park, the horticulturists from the city worked very closely with the landscape architects. It was the first park in China that actually showcased native plantings, which is kind of amazing, and that it was 1996. And it shows how water can be cleansed through settlement, through filtration, through constructed wetlands, and through aeration. But as the water gets to the end of its journey in this pool, this has become a real refuge and a real woodland, but it's managed like Queens Plaza, like a garden, with gardeners actually weeding and pruning and taking care so that this view doesn't just become a tangle. It's also really recognized as a cultural place, an important cultural place, and as a recreational place. So this is that same pool a little farther down where there are no trees. So all of these things really kind of interweave. For the competition for Governor's Island, this is one of 5 entries, and we were really trying to design a park where we were thinking about how is this place going to be managed. Just not like an urban garden, because you just don't have the kind of public staff that's going to be able to deal with 80 acres as opposed to 6 acres, or as opposed to 1.5 acres at the park in Queens Plaza. So we thought, what if you have a kind of a public-private partnership to leverage the developers actually to build the park space, so that farms would actually go over the new developed buildings in the center. And then at the southern end, which is the most kind of sublime end of Governor's Island, looking out to the harbor, the Aman Resort group was really interested in building a resort at the bottom of Governor's Island. So we said, okay, well, don't spend all of your money doing some fancy skin, as we're seeing now in one particular intersection in Brooklyn at the moment. Just make, from all the demolition of the buildings at Governor's Island, just make topography, make a hill, and embed your buildings in the hill, and make a ravine. And then the ravine will become a place where, for Olmsted's vision of a park as a place where people who can't get out of the city can come to experience feeling like they're out of the city. This could have a camp, and the camp and whatever, the harbor school and other schools could actually do a lot of the maintenance and have it be a laboratory for how to create a ravine woodland on Governor's Island. So you always have to think when you're doing these projects, how are you going to build into the program a way of maintaining this? And many projects have very different strategies. For Trenton, we won this competition to design the Capitol Parks. This is the State House. A lot of the real estate was taken up with the whole restoration of the riparian landscape, riparian corridor. But then we had these garden bridges on the old spans from the old roadway. That takes a very specific kind of garden maintenance. Then these are a lot like the structures that Keith showed along the stream corridors, where they would be kind of armored, new woodland. So how do you actually get the manpower to understand this is a very skilled kind of maintenance? I think somebody talked about intelligence in maintaining this kind of landscape, and you really do need a very highly skilled kind of maintenance to know how to treat all of these different kinds of landscapes. So we conceived of an environmental center at the middle that would be using this as its lab in how to restore or regenerate a riparian landscape, and also how to have it be a visually beautiful place. But I wanted to show this. You can't really see it, but I really do want to mention, a lot of people have talked about fences. Fences, I think, are the next frontier for design, because they are here to stay. You can't actually do any of these landscapes without cordoning off some of it. So why don't we have a competition to design a fence that's really cheap and really beautiful, and maybe habitat in its own right. I did a study for Lake Ontario for a bird wall that was giving shelter from the wind, but it also acts as habitat. And then for Liberty State Park, a bird blind that actually is a sort of living material, and at least would be habitat for some of the invertebrates that we just saw on Keith's list. And other people have talked today about how site-specific this work is. This project in Mexico is not a forest, but it's a desert, and a lot of the principles that we've been talking about apply, where it's really specific. Like this, you might think this is just desert planting, but it's actually a green roof. This is occupied space, but it's a brown roof, doing the same thing that a, quote, green roof of sedum would do. And we went out into the desert and looked at how plants, we were doing that studying how the plants occur in the desert in this very quirky, idiosyncratic way, and we brought that back into the domestic landscape for this retreat. But we conceived of it as different landscapes, this being the kind of conceit that it's just the native landscape that's kind of jumping over and happening in this courtyard. But then as you get out to the views, this is actually the Pacific River, the Pacific Ocean. It's a very large river. This is actually maintained as a sculptural foreground It's the same plants, often the same plants, but it's maintained sort of to within an inch of its life to be a sculptural foreground to the views beyond, not only of the ocean, but of the whales, because this is a big whale highway. And the final project I wanted to talk about is the project in the Western Ghats. To say that, well, in fact, after Beth's talk, I should say there are woodlands and there are forests, and there are woodlands and there are forests. Because this project is 2,500 acres. I've been working on this for over 15 years. And this is this amazing ridge. This is near the monsoon time, so it's very green, but it also gets red and desert conditions in the summer. And this is this massive forest in the middle that's very, very healthy, also very fragile. And my job really early on was to say you just can't do anything in there at all. But everybody wanted to do something with the forest or the woodland. They wanted to put buildings in there. One retreat architect came and said, this is where we're going to put the jungle lodge. You didn't mention jungles. You're talking about forest and woodland. So what I thought we had to do then was to, if you can't, to actually use all of the disturbed parts of the site. This is that ridge. This is all of the rice fields and the major nala. And this is all what was a very eroded savanna and these very eroded slopes at the lower levels. So we cited all of the new program there in the disturbed areas and did a lot of regeneration. It's taken 10 years for it really to mature. And this underscores my feeling that you have to have a lot of time to save money. Because over the years, this is some of the lower, the spa is in the sort of rice field areas, and then everything else is on the slopes. We did thousands of linear meters of trenching to slow the water down and make the conditions better for regenerating forest on these slopes. This is sort of what it looked like before, and this is what it looks like now. This is a bridge between two parts of the program. So we thought if you can't bring the buildings into the forest, we'll actually bring the woodland to the buildings. So this is all woodland that wasn't there 10 years ago. And it's woodland that you can walk through and is part of the program of the resort retreat. And this is sort of a whole new industry. We've started a nursery about 10 years ago and have germinated and propagated a couple 100,000 plants that were all used. And that little tiny plant we saw in the previous presentation really resonated with me because you really need to start little in a place like this that has such harsh conditions. Plants are going to have to be able to endure both inundation in the monsoon and desert conditions. So you have to start very small. So I just think in each one of these projects, I think every project that we've seen today, you have to make a lot of decisions. There's just no such thing as designing a woodland. You have to say, are you kind of making a figure ground boardwalk through nature? Are you actually creating all these different zones, like a sort of a traditional garden, English garden? Are you creating a whole network? Are you integrating canopy, understory? In this project, we've used understory trees around the major public buildings so that we'll retain the views out to the mountains. And here you can see this is an understory native tree. You can just see the mountains beyond and the designed foreground. And then in terms of the maintenance, what are you going to be doing? Are you pruning? Are you thinning? Are you transplanting? Are you planting a lot of new plants? So all of these decisions have to be taken very mindfully and the process really designed. And in this case, I also think you have to honor the history of the site. This was a tree that was these trees were in the savanna, but now it's all become forested on this side. And we designed the public buildings around some of these old specimens, sort of the wolf trees that had been standing on their own. So these three different kinds of approaches, whether on the left it's actually creating a new woodland, in the middle it's actually designing through maintenance, and then at Queens Plaza it's really designing a new type of landscape where there's no real distinction line between woodland and city. All of them are really the product of design, and I am very pleased that Central Park has taken this on because this has been it's been such a pioneering organization that's way out there, and I think that this has been very inspiring, and I think is inspiring all of us to go out and really deal with this issue of the